Welcome to the future now. So what does the future hold? Well, the future is something that we create with our plans, our strategies, our decisions. We create our future. So if we look around, um, are we creating the kind of future that we want, that we desire? If you look at the way we exploit the environment, if you look at the global division of wealth, if you look at the political situation in the Middle East, I would say there's room for improvement. We could do with some better solutions. So how do we find these better solutions? Now we know if we address a problem from the same frame of reference that creates the problem, we're not going to find a solution. This is a way people like to paraphrase Einstein sometimes. So my suggestion is that what we need to do is we need to change our mental habits. So mental habits are ways we view the world, ways we like to interpret the way things are. And philosophers have been thinking about these things for ages, which means we're going to do a little bit of philosophy today. Some of these mental habits we have are so important, they're so fundamental, they were made into laws of thought. Aristotle wrote them down in his Prior Analytics, and to him there were three classical laws of thought. The first is the law of identity, which states that everything is identical to itself, which seems something that we can agree with. Second law states that you can have no contradictions. You cannot say something that's true and not true at the same time. The third law says that everything you say has to be either true or not true. There is no middle ground. This is why they call it the law of the excluded middle. Now what I'm thinking, so there are many unsolved problems in philosophy, and there are many unsolved problems in logic as well. Now it turns out, if you question some of these classical laws of thought, as this guy did, it turns out some of these problems become more solvable. So the idea of questioning some of these laws has some merit. So the second classical law of thought states that you cannot have contradictions. So we can apply this law in Western thinking. We apply this law in logic and mathematics when we make proofs. If you want to prove that something is not true, we can derive a contradiction. And when we derive a contradiction, well, a contradiction is something absurd. We can't handle it in a way. So when a contradiction is derived, it's as if everything stops making sense, and anything might be true, or they say everything is true. They call this the principle of explosion. So the contradiction leads to a situation where anything goes, and so it's used in a negative way to prove that something is untrue, because when it leads to a contradiction, anything goes, and there's no more reliable truth. Now, there exists a completely different approach to contradictions. It was invented by Heinrich Altschuler, a Russian inventor, who asked himself the question, how do inventors come up with new ideas? And this question led him to a lot of research and eventually to the concept that most breakthrough creative solutions start from a contradiction. This approach he called a theory of inventive problem solving. In Russian, it's an acronym that spells TRIZ, TRIZ. So TRIZ is an approach that really makes the contradiction the fundamental starting point for your solution. So this theory of inventive problem solving, TRIZ, starts with contradictions. Now we saw that contradictions to Western thinking are nothing but a problem, a headache, it's a breakdown of the system. So how do you use contradictions in a creative manner? Well, TRIZ has a number of really powerful tools to do that. One of them starts with identifying, analyzing your situation in terms of general properties, and then finding a contradiction between these general properties. And what you can do, if you find this, is look up your specific contradiction in a table, and the table then gives you certain general principles you can apply to that situation. It looks like this. It's quite a complex thing, but what it really is a map of all the possible contradictions you might face in your situation, and a guide of how to solve the kind of typical situations that you might find yourself in. So this is one very powerful tool that TRIZ has. Another one is, there's an algorithm Altshuler calls the algorithm of invention, and what you really do there is you analyze your situation and you find a contradiction that you then exaggerate as much as you can. So rather than shying away from the contradiction, you're actually diving deep into it, trying to make the contradiction as sharp as possible, so that really what happens is that you create for the mind's eye something that is truly impossible. It's impossible to handle this contradiction. Now this is exactly the point where TRIZ wants you to be, in a state facing an impossible problem, in a kind of crisis. And the idea is that only if you bring your mind there, then you are most free from your mental habits. There's a wonderful application of the same principles to education. Tatjana Sidurchuk and Nikolai Komenko developed this TRIZ for Kids approach. What a wonderful book. It's called Thoughtivity for Kids. And so the idea is to take the same kind of problem solving skills, identifying contradictions, using them for a creative process, to start doing this with children in elementary school and high school. In Russia, this program is already quite large. Hundreds of schools are doing this. In the Netherlands, a few schools have experimented a little bit with these approaches. If you want to learn problem solving, why not start with teaching it to children? Business is about values, and there are many things changing in business. There's new technology, there are new marketing trends happening, but the best way to understand the dynamics of business is to understand what's changing in the values behind the business. Now, values come in opposites. Big, small, simple, complex. And so now that we learned that contradictions play such an important role in innovation in the creative process, we can take this to the arena of business, and we can say, so understanding changing values in terms of contradiction between values, that's a useful way. And in fact, this idea of changing values is not a new one. The philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche, great visionary of our culture, he saw this coming. He saw European culture at some point being confronted with what he called a transvaluation of all values, with which he meant a situation where really a number of values that we've cherished for a long time will be tipped over or simply completely turned around. In 2005, I wrote a paper for the Club of Amsterdam Summit for the Future addressing exactly this point. It was about a kind of transvaluation of business values. And it shows different examples of how the things that are changing at the level of values. We value hierarchies less and networks more. We value owning less than we value sharing. So there's a whole list of examples that gives you a better and deeper understanding of current business dynamics. So now, if you take contradictory values, if you take two opposite values, the space in between those values is really like a frame of reference for the influence of either the one value or the opposing value. The Hungarian philosopher Arthur Koestler has a theory of creativity where he says that new ideas arise from the combining of two separate frames of reference. He calls this a bisociation, something that's quite different from an association. And so it's this combining of frames of reference that is the source of creativity to Koestler. And so now these ideas we can use because we understand the power of contradictions and we understand the power of combining frames of reference. And so with this now, you can make models like Will McWhinney did. He was interested in complex change, and what he did really was use these ideas to create really these kind of models. And you see the contradictions here, and they're combined. And so from this model arises what he calls a number of different worldviews that gives you a lot of insight into the dynamics of change. So these kinds of models are also what we at Ad Valorem use and apply to context. So for instance, you can take an understanding of the dynamics behind team behavior to create a tool set that gives you some insight in compatibility in teams, team leadership and things like that. Another area of application is client profiles. So it's possible with these models based on contradictions and frames of reference to understand better the values behind the client's behavior and thereby to make the client's behavior a little bit more predictable. So these are a number of applications that we've developed here at Ad Valorem in Amsterdam. Now in conclusion, I would like to give a few examples of the kind of ideas I think are real examples of transvaluation of values, of turning a situation completely around. The best solutions are solutions that solve the problem where everybody wins and that cost nothing. So it's about also thinking about resources. If you want to solve a problem in this way, you have to think about using what you already have or becoming very smart about what you already have. So how does that work in practice? Take the example of ocean pollution. There's a huge amount of plastic in the oceans and it's killing the fish and the sea life. It collects in these huge gyres in the Pacific Ocean. There's one and there's other ones as well. It's a big problem. It's really a huge problem, and you would think a huge problem requires huge resources to tackle. Well, there's a young man in the Netherlands called Boyan Slat who figured out that the ocean itself is a very, very powerful system of currents. So why not use the power of the ocean to get the ocean clean? Because that's a very useful, very good use of resources. Another example, a guy called David Katz, he started the plastic bank, taking something that is useless trash for most people in the world and turning it into something that has value. And he's completely shifting the whole recycling scene in third world countries. Or take the lowly rat. It's an animal that we feel discomfort with. There's this group of people, researchers, that started a company called Apopo, and they use these rats to save human lives. Again, turning the reputation of this mammal completely around. These are very beautiful examples of resource thinking, of really creative solutions to these complex problems. Well, so this is where a little bit of philosophy can take you. I'd like to thank Felix for giving me the opportunity to share some of my ideas today, and I'd like to thank you for taking the time to listen to me. I will leave you with some references, and perhaps until we meet sometime in the future.